Alright, I'd like to share with you an excerpt from what I believe to be a very important book. It's called Understanding Power, The Indispensable Chomsky by intellectual and author and MIT professor Noam Chomsky. This is a piece about nonviolence, using nonviolence as a means of changing different power structures with movements. It's a question and answer format. So the question is, Mr. Chomsky, I've always hoped we could dissemble corporate capitalism through nonviolent, yet very determined and organized resistance, and the creation of alternative institutions that could someday take over and diffuse power peacefully. I'm wondering, do you think that kind of hope for nonviolence is at all realistic? And how do you feel about the use of violence in general? Chomsky's response: well, like I say, nobody really knows anything much about tactics. At least I don't. But I think you have to think through the nonviolence question in detail. I mean, anybody is going to try to do things nonviolently if possible. What is the point of violence? But when you begin to encroach on power, you may find it necessary to defend your rights, and defense of your rights sometimes does require violence. Then either you use it or you don't, depending on your moral values. So take a look at American labor history. Around the first half of the century, hundreds of millions of American workers were simply killed by security forces for just trying to organize. The United States has an unusually violent labor history. So violent, in fact, that if you read the right-wing British press in the 1890s, the right-wing British press, just like the London Times, they couldn't understand the brutality of the treatment of American workers and their lack for rights. And it's not because the workers were trying to be violent. It's because the people with power were violently protecting their power against people trying to get elementary rights. Alright, if you're a pacifist or something, you have to ask yourself some questions at that point. Are people allowed to defend themselves by force when they're attacked by force? Well, okay, people's values may differ on that, but those are at least the questions. My own opinion is that popular movements should try a lot of tactics, but even things that are nonviolent on their face could become violent. For example, one thing that I think is important is the building of a political party which could then enter the political arena and represent the population. I mean, it's certainly conceivable that such a party could exist in the United States, but if such a party ever got any power, people in power with the society would defend themselves against it. And at that point, everyone's got to decide. Do you use violence to protect your rights, or don't you? Look, violence usually comes from the powerful. People may talk about it coming from the revolutionaries, but that's typically because they're attacked and then they defend themselves with the use of violence. The same question also arises with another thing that I think has to go on now: the building up of alternative media and the networks of activist organizations which could help bring people together to fight the effects of indoctrination like we've been talking about. Again, that's not violent, but only up to the point where it starts to have the effect of undermining corporate power. When then you may discover that if it's not going to be nonviolent anymore, because the rich may find ways of defending themselves with violence. So talking about nonviolence is easy, but personally I can't really see it taking it as an absolute principle. Now, of course, there are also ways of transcending violence. Like if enough people got together and took over a factory, let's say, the police would try and stop them. But ultimately, the police and soldiers are just other people, and if understanding and solidarity were to spread enough, they wouldn't stop them. So in a sense, one answer to your question just has to be with more solidarity, broader solidarity. So they can't bring in soldiers from someplace else to smash people up. But that's going to be hard. We simply have to face that. It's not going to happen on its own. The fact that societies today are so stratified and divided by hatreds means that elites don't have to go very far away to bring in people who are willing to repress it. But that can change. In fact, it has to change, because there is a real limit to how much popular movements can defend themselves with violence and still maintain a popular democratic character, in my opinion.